He had the orchid inked behind his ear the night they first said nothing, the same spot where he'd kissed her after the gallery closed and the city lights turned from glass to a slow, forgiving blur. Sally Nelson could still trace the crescent of that tattoo with her fingertip when she thought of him, and the skin there warmed like an ember under her memory. 3 years of stolen mornings, of rehearsals that ended with whispered promises and locked doors. 3 years of knowing, with a clarity that hurt, that he would never say the word that mattered. He refused to marry her. Sally kept that sentence like a ledger in her head. Accounts opened, entries balanced, debts settled. It never read like anger so much as inventory. The nights she had waited alone, the times she'd swallowed a question to preserve his calm, the small humiliations arranged by logistics and image. She loved him quietly, with the economy of someone who could not afford extravagance. He had learned to love being cherished quietly, as if her devotion were a private asset that would never need to be shown. The dance studio smelled of rosin and lemon oil that morning, the windows opened to a brittle March wind that fluttered the flyers for the community recital. Light slanted across the floorboards in long, patient beams. Sally moved through a sequence with the kind of economy that made everything look effortless. A lift here, a planted foot there, a line held in the air like an unfinished sentence. Her students watched, mouths slack, faith fixed on the kind of certainty only a teacher can offer. "You should go to auditions," her niece Zoe said between stretches, breath fogging. "You deserve bigger stages." Sally smiled without turning. Zoe was 8 and already believed there was a world that would always give what you worked for. Sally liked believing that for Zoe. For herself, the ledger kept making small, uncomfortable adjustments. The messages appeared on her phone at odd hours. Snapshots of coffee cups, a blurred photo of her hand in his during a gallery opening, a voice note that said nothing more than the sound of the city outside Quentin Young's penthouse. Quentin's texts were economical the way he was. Single-line confessions, fewer than necessary. He cancelled too often, or arrived late, or suggested meetings in the gray hours between his public life and the day he had to be someone else. He never brought her into his world. He kept her in a room of his making. He had reasons, he told her. Reputation, branding, family expectations. His father's firm, fragile alliances. Chloe's discreet but cutting questions about logistics. "You can't just change everything," his sister would say when she thought he wasn't listening. She wasn't cruel, not exactly. She was precise, protective, but practical. The problem lay in how Quentin translated protection into silence. From Sally's point of view, the secrecy ate at the very things that mattered. She taught young girls to cross thresholds and own the space once they did. She taught them to step forward when the music asked for courage. The girl in the mirror who had once wanted nothing more than to keep dancing, now wanted a life with someone who would choose to be seen with her in a way that meant safety, not shame. Commitment had become for her the litmus test of respect. Quentin Young was at his desk that same morning, a space of glass and inherited books that smelled faintly of leather and citrus water. His company's latest campaign filled the screens behind him, clean images, powerful lines. He ran his finger along the rim of his coffee mug, thinking in the clipped, efficient rhythms that suited a man who negotiated mergers the way other people chose their shirts. He loved certain things fiercely, the feel of control, the architecture of deals, the spark that darted between power and adoration. Sally belonged to another set of loves. She loved the measure of an aperture opening on a stage, the way a child would look up at a teacher as if they were seeing the shape of the world for the first time. Quentin loved to be wanted. He loved the quiet confidence of being able to take without being asked. He had learned over years to separate affection from commitment. It was cleaner, he thought, to claim affection and never to risk the entanglement of promise. "There's a time for everything," he told her once, palms open like a man making a simple argument. "You know what my life demands. I'm offering what I can." Sally listened. She tasted the words and found their edges blunt. She wanted a yes, a ring, the ordinary granularity of a life that would include shared bills and blended families, and a house small enough for Zoe to run in. He offered instead the glamour of sequestration, private jets, private nights, undoubted loyalty that never moved into public light. Outside both their private worlds, the city was thirsty for spectacle. The internet did not sleep. It anthologized small failures and immortalized banal gestures into trends and headlines. You could not be private anymore because someone always had their camera out. Quentin's life existed both on terraces and in the curated columns of glossy magazines. To remain unseen with someone like Sally was to court risk. If the ledger of social capital shifted one way, hers would be the first to be withdrawn. Bianca Wood existed in the kind of spotlight that devoured discretion. She moved through rooms like perfume, bright and invasive. Her PR team sculpted her presence. Her laughter was a matter of scheduling. She wanted what Quentin had not because she loved him. She wanted him because he polished the edges of her platform. The chemistry between them wasn't necessarily frictionless, it was strategic. When Bianca smiled and rested her hand near his elbow at a charity gala, cameras obliged. She was the kind of woman who could make a publicist sweat with the right angle and a single staged embrace. Chloe watched all this with the exacting eyes of a surgeon. She had the look of someone who never trusted easy statements. When Quentin returned home late, smelling faintly of expensive cologne and failure to meet a commitment, she would keep the question in reserve like a clean knife, deliberate, sharp, necessary. "You need to decide," she'd say once, out of patience. "People don't linger on what you mean to them. They linger on what you show them." He deflected. He loved his sister. He loved Sally. He loved the small private gestures that made his day. But love for him did not necessarily translate into socially binding contracts. It was a philosophy that made sense in boardrooms and in rows of ledgers. It struggled when met with the human demand for certainty. That was the small, steady friction that would become a fault line when pressure arrived, not from inside but from the glare outside. The first time Sally felt the world tilt on the axis of unmanaged exposure, it was as subtle as a vibration on the wrist. She was rehearsing a duet when her phone lit up. A name she didn't often see, a social channel she would check only reluctantly. There was a clip, 40 seconds. A staged moment at a press event, a hug caught halfway between embrace and endorsement. Bianca laughing too loud, Quentin smiling in a way that made something in Sally's chest loosen like a knot. Someone had filmed it from across the room, someone had posted it. Within an hour, the clip had gathered a tide of commentary in which nothing was kind. It was an itch that would not stop until it had blistered. Sally sat down on the floor with her back against the bar and watched the comments scroll like rain. Some were small and curious. Others implied nominations and futures she did not recognize. "He's with her now," one paraphrase read, a demand transformed into a verdict. Another asked if she was the woman in the background. Someone said it was all proof of a PR stunt. The words were not direct threats, but they worked like frost, little, precise, unwielding. She had seen the internet do this to other people, celebrities and private citizens alike. There was a familiar rhythm to the public's appetite, first curiosity, then possession, then the rush to judgment. She felt unmoored by the sense of people trying to own a private moment and the private people who inhabited it. For Quentin, the clip might have been a favorable sign. For her, it felt like someone had thrown open a window in a room she had tried to keep closed. When she called him, he answered with a short tone that made it clear the call was a distraction. "What now?" he asked, as if the world were a set of items to be managed. "Someone shared a clip," she said, the words simple because the ledger required them to be. "It's getting attention. Already?" There was a pause. "I'll handle it," he said more. A promise styled like a contract. "We'll control the narrative." She tried to trust him, to believe in the architecture of his control, but trust had slowly become a thin ledger line. It needed regular deposits, and lately the deposits had been small. This was the beginning of a domino he would not see fall until it had toppled his certainty. For now, the clip was a breath. It did not yet feel like a storm. The first CTA in life, an unspoken pact to restart, came in the form of a small request. After the rehearsal, when the students had trickled out and the studio hummed with the echoes of someone else's applause, Sally walked to the row of lockers and found a note tucked inside. It was from her mother, a gentle nudge, reminding her to keep records of income and suggesting she consider a local festival that paid well. It was the kind of pragmatic love Sally's family gave, not pretty, but faithful. She tucked the note into her phone case and, against habit, opened the comments for the clip again, less to read than to measure. The internet is hungry for a story that confirms itself. It would convert ambiguity into a timeline. She could feel the momentum shifting. If she allowed herself to be invisible, the world might write its own narrative for her. If she stepped forward, she risked scandal but gained control. If this story is the kind you love, consider subscribing. There are more like it, small choices that change the shape of a life. That line, subtle and unrelated to the immediate drama, sat odd in her mind for a moment, a reminder that someone else's life could be commodified for consumption. She closed the app. Sam Clark was not spectacle. He was careful in the way people are who have lived in classrooms and libraries. His gestures were calibrated for listening rather than showing. He taught humanities at the local college and ran a modest workshop at the community center, where he had sat through one of Sally's classes because his niece wanted to learn to pirouette. He stayed for coffee afterward and, over several weeks, proved himself to be the kind of man who took the time to remember the little facts other people thought unimportant. Her favorite tea, the way she tucked hair behind her ear when she was thinking, the name of the child from her beginner class who had trouble with coordination. Sam arrived in Sally's life like a soft chorus. He didn't demand. He offered afternoons of steady conversation and the sort of domestic predictability that had begun to look very beautiful to someone tired of being hidden. His family welcomed her without pretense. His sister brought over lasagna and opinions that felt like care rather than counsel. Sam's affection was not flashy. It was reliable in a way that made the underside of Sally's life rest. She did not confuse comfort with surrender. There were nights when the orchid tattoo would come to her mind, its crescent of ink, Quentin's laughter when he showed it to her for the first time, the way their palms fit together. She wrote the dates of their better days in the margins of her mind like a careful archivist, but the ledger had a recurring line: respect. Sam offered her a life where her teaching mattered, where applause was not a threat but a seal. He courted her with a steadiness that refused urgency, a quality that felt rooted in the soil rather than the flash of fireworks. Quentin grew aware of Sam in the way anyone notices a steady weather change, gradually and with an odd irritation. At first he attributed it to coincidence, to a new friendship that would not last. But there were things that eroded him. A family dinner where Sally arrived with a casserole Sam had recommended, a photo of Sally at the park with Zoe and Sam's niece, a picture that had no trace of the glamour Quentin knew how to manufacture. He saw an image of Sally smiling in a way that had nothing to do with him, and it stung more than he expected. He told himself that he would wait. He told himself that if he offered the right structure, if he made the right public move at the right moment, he could reclaim what was private. Waiting was a privilege he believed he still had. But waiting is not neutral. It is a deliberate choice, and in choosing to wait, he was making a decision about her life without asking. The city, meanwhile, had its own impatience. Bianca's handlers saw an opportunity in a sleepy scandal. The hug at the press event could be leveraged into a narrative arc where Bianca and Quentin had an obvious chemistry, where Sally had been reduced to an inconvenient footnote. Pixels turned to headlines. A late-night talk show chose the story as a talking point. The clip, which had been anonymous but for one distinctive ring on a finger, acquired a name and a tone. Commentary came in waves. Some voices suggested craft. PR moves are often applauded by those who live by optics, but most were eager for a story they could sell. Infidelity, a secret romance unmasked, the fragile private trampled by public appetite. Sally felt it like a bruise forming under the skin. Students whispered, parents called, tentative, about an old rumor. A local journalist phoned with questions about whether Sally would comment, whether the dance studio was a proper place for a partner in a high-profile relationship. Her inbox filled with letters from people who wanted her to say more than she had decided to say. Each message made the ledger tilt. She called Quentin again, not with accusation so much as calculation. "I'm getting calls," she said. The words were even. "People expect a response. My students deserve clarity." He paused on the other end. "Let them talk," he said finally. "There's nothing to say." The silence that followed felt like a verdict. He had the power to quiet the storm. Instead, he asked her to live under it. There were other pressures, quieter but no less significant. Sally's parents worried aloud about reputation in ways they long ago learned to translate into practical advice. "You have to think about stability," her mother said, her voice patient like an old clock. "People will decide what they think unless you decide for them." Sally could feel Zoe watching her with the earnestness of a child learning how to be brave. Dancing had taught Sally how to stand in the face of an audience. Standing in the face of public opinion was a different challenge. The scandal moved fast because that is what these things do. Quentin, who had spent his life shaping narratives, found himself caught by one that felt like an accident. For someone who controlled much, the calculus of being seen in the wrong light felt like a threat to his faculties. He met with his PR team, he arranged statements, he positioned himself publicly in ways that would not have happened if he had simply made a personal choice at the outset. But the damage was not only to him, it was to her. A teacher asking parents to look past gossip, a studio being whispered about in the way of small businesses that depend on faith. Bianca watched all of this with a mixture of satisfaction and something unreadable. She knew the currency of spectacle. She leveraged it with a professionalism that felt like ruthlessness. Someone would call it ambition, or perhaps that was only another word for calculated survival. But she had her own risks to manage, and Quentin was useful. Whether she loved him or loved the sheen he offered was, in the end, less important than the shape of her move. Sally's decision formed not in a single declarative moment, but like a series of small, precise adjustments. The ledger tipped when a parent withdrew their child citing distractions, when an assistant resigned under the weight of speculation, when once regular donations slowed to a trickle. People began to ask the wrong questions about her judgment, about her stability. The indignity was not loud, it was practical and corrosive. Sam continued to be a steady presence. He showed up with a thermos of tea one evening, sat in the back of the studio, and watched without comment. After class, he hung back and offered to help move some overturned chairs. He asked about Zoe, and then about Sally's plans. He did not rush to tell her how he felt. He showed her the kind of patience that, to Sally, had become rare and therefore valuable. On a rainy Thursday, after a day of calls and a teaching assistant who had been ill with worry, Sally met Sam for coffee under a water-dark awning. The street reflected the neon of a bakery sign in yards of black water. Reflections wavered like cautious promises. "I don't want to be the woman who has to explain herself to strangers," she said. "I've worked too hard to be minimized into a rumor." "You don't have to," Sam replied. His voice was plain. "You deserve people who stand with you without needing proof." She thought of the orchid crescent behind his ear, details he had shared in private. She thought of Quentin's hand, the warmth she had learned to favor in a world otherwise cold. She thought of small children looking up to her for a teacher who wouldn't let gossip restructure their dreams. She felt, for the first time in a very long time, a fierce responsibility to herself. Walking away would not be simple. It would require severing more than a secret. It would mean stepping into a life where her decisions would have short-term costs and long-term integrity. It would mean letting go of a pattern of affection that had cost her nothing but had demanded everything in return. Still, the choice began to sound like music, one she could trust to last. She told Quentin, not with a plea but with a clarity that had been carved by small indignities. "I can't be private forever," she said. "I'm not something to be kept between your press conferences and your apologies. I need to know I'm chosen." He listened to the words and heard them as an inconvenience. "You know I love you," he said. "You know I'm not the sort of man who rushes things. I'm careful because I have to be." "Careful is not the same as committed," she said. He tried to argue. He tried to bargain. He detailed his reasons and layered them with promises about future plans that always seemed to hinge on a moment in which the right conditions would suddenly exist. She had heard these plans before, structured, plausible, and always anchored to a moment that never arrived. If love is a promise, she decided, fidelity must be visible in the small, repeatable acts of consent. He had offered a narrative of protection, of a branded privacy, rather than an actual life. She could not trade the dignity of being known for the veneer of being cherished in secret. The walkaway was practical. She found herself clearing small boxes, a photograph of them at a mutual friend's garden party, a pair of ballet shoes he had complained about stepping on when he arrived late to the studio. She left a note in the pocket of his jacket when she returned what belonged to him. It read simply, "I want to be loved in public and private. If you cannot do that, I cannot stay." When she stepped out into the rain, the city met her with a cry of silver. Water ran down the brim of her hat and into the collar of her coat. She felt the rain like absolution and like punishment. It smelled like the kind of cleansing that requires acknowledgement. It did not erase the ledger. People with umbrellas passed without slowing. The world kept moving. Quentin found the jacket and the note the next afternoon. The scent of her perfume lingered in the pocket like a legal brief. He read the words slowly and felt the air in the room change dimension. For someone who had always believed negotiation could fix anything, the note landed like an immovable object. He called and nothing connected. He sent messages and each one felt more performative than the last because they were a recorded attempt to re-enter a life she had already begun to step out of. He arranged meetings with his counsel, with those who advised on public perception, and with a private grief he had not expected to know. His sister watched him with the same precise eyes that never left him for long. "You broke something," she said, in a voice that was not entirely without tenderness. "You knew what you were doing." "She left," he said. The admission came out smaller than he might have imagined. "She left because you wouldn't risk anything for her," Chloe replied. "You kept her in a safe space for yourself. That is the real problem." Quentin, who had always been a man who thought in terms of thresholds and measures, felt a fissure form in his interior life. He walked the corridors of his company like a man passing through his own past triumphs and wondering which of them were hollow. Contracts were binding, profits were real, but they didn't replace the quiet thing that Sally had been to him, the one who could name him, the one who held an orchid crescent in her memory like a key. He realized, in small, painful increments, that absence could be an education. It could teach you the negative space left by the person you had not valued. At first, he clung to pride. He told himself she would come back when she felt the weight of being without him. He told himself he would orchestrate the right apology, the right public move, the right signal to let her know he'd changed. But change is a slow ledger. It is a list of consistent small acts, not a single decisive declaration. For the first time, Quentin understood that the thing he had refused to give, public, visible commitment, was not merely a social badge. It was a kind of moral contract he had neglected to sign, a civic kindness that said you see someone and choose them in a way that includes risk. Sally, meanwhile, did not make her decision because Quentin had angered her, or because Bianca had elevated the spectacle. She left because she recognized that love coupled with secrecy was thin, and that a life that could be erased by a single clip was not a life she wanted to build on. There is courage in refusing to be erased. The rain continued, persistent and honest, when she packed a single useful bag. The orchid motif showed up again, this time as a small pendant Quentin had given her, which she decided to leave in a drawer marked for things past. There was nothing theatrical in the way she left. No slammed doors, no cinematic confrontations. Just the patient, unshowy act of untangling a life from the assumptions of someone who could not name it in public. Her first night away, she slept in a room that smelled of freshly laundered sheets and Sam's slow-moving warmth. It was not an ending as much as a fork. One path toward a future that might be built with someone steady, and another that might yet be reclaimed if Quentin chose differently. For now, she gathered the small courage of her decision like a light and let it warm her face. Word leaked out in the way such things do, at first in whispers, then in the soft hum of talk show speculation. People, hungry for stories that confirm their anxieties, filled the gaps with their own conclusions. Some defended her, others latched onto rumors. But the important things, Zoe's continued laughter, the steady persistence of students who kept coming to class, Sam bringing over a bowl of soup and a quiet, present hand, continued. Small things, sturdy things, the fact that she could answer the door and find a friend's face, the way applause at the end of a rehearsal felt like an ecosystem restoring itself. Quentin's realization, when it began, wasn't theatrical. It came in the small arithmetic of missing gestures. No late-night messages with the cropped photo of a moonlit street. No warm coffee cups left in odd places. His phone did not vibrate the way it had. He found himself walking into rooms that had once been cluttered with her presence and noticing how their surfaces retained an echo. He tried to manufacture contact and found the effort sterile. He tried to orchestrate a public statement as if a memo could reweave what he had unraveled by omission. One night, he stood at his apartment window and watched rain turn the skyline into a smear of pearl. He was used to power, to creating outcomes. But this absence was not a problem to be solved by logistics. It was a lesson in what it means to be seen, and it asked a kind of labor he had always avoided, the slow, humble work of proof. Quentin found himself surrounded by advisors and yet profoundly alone. The office hummed with the sound of business mergers and brand recalibrations, but there was no pivot that could return what he had declined to publicly own. He began to reevaluate small decisions, how often he canceled, what he allowed secrecy to do to their lives, the ways in which his choices had eroded trust. Because he had refused to marry her, because he chose private convenience over visible commitment, Sally walked away. That fact lodged in him like a stone. But stones teach by weight. They don't always change you the moment you touch them. Quentin had to learn, slowly and painfully, what it meant to value someone beyond the utility of being wanted. He would learn that the labor of earning trust back was not a press release or a grand gesture, but a catalogue of small, sustained acts. For now, the city kept its noise. The rain tapered off into a persistent mist. Cameras found other stories to amplify. People moved through their days. But in small corners, an empty jacket pocket, a studio with a teacher who now moved through her class with a different kind of serenity, something had shifted. The ledger had a new entry, a loss that required reflection. The next steps were not yet written. Quentin would have to decide whether to let the realization calcify into genuine change or allow it to harden into a regret that improved nothing. Sally would in turn decide whether a new life with steadiness and respect could be the thing she needed, whether forgiveness could be earned, and whether her heart had room for both caution and trust. On the street, a passerby noticed an orchid pendant glinting in the rain and thought it beautiful. They moved on. The city allowed for countless stories to bloom and wither. For the people in it, these were not spectacles but lives. The ledger, for both of them, had been rewritten, but entries still had to be proved true. The ledger had been rewritten, but entries still needed proof. Months unrolled themselves in small, unshowy increments, emails unanswered, nights with one less laugh, rehearsals where a chair remained conspicuously empty. Quentin tried at first to treat absence like a scheduling problem. Shift the board meeting, call the right person, craft the right statement. The problem was not strategy. It was absence itself, the negative space of a life that had been present in 1,000 ordinary places. He had not counted on the way ordinary things accrue into meaning. The first sharp moment of consequence came at an industry event that had nothing to do with lovers and everything to do with optics. It was a gala where cameras and narratives were both willing instruments. Bianca moved through the room like a headline, and Quentin, less practiced at managing the raw edges of his own feelings than he was at managing deals, went to speak to her. He intended to ask for discretion, to draw a line and put the episode to rest. Instead, the interaction fractured. Words were thrown in the bright air. Bianca, adept at turning attention into advantage, pushed back with a sharpness that made a scene imminent. A security detail intervened. Someone shouted. A sudden shove sent Quentin stumbling against a marble column. He hit the floor and for a moment the room went sideways. Voices blurred into distant rain. He woke in a hospital bed with an IV in his arm and a bruise blooming on his temple. The pain was small and the humility large. His wounded leg insisted on crutches, and the office that had once been a theater of his absolute authority became an inaccessible distance. The command of movement, walking between meetings, catching flights, was replaced by the slower mathematics of healing. He had to ask for help. For a man used to delegating, asking felt like a new profession. Chloe did not make performances of concern. She moved through the hospital room with the same exacting neatness with which she had always cut through avoidance. "You let things build into a problem instead of naming them," she said the first evening, perched at his bedside like a judge who has not yet given up on relief. "You thought you were protecting people. You were protecting your own convenience." "I never wanted her hurt," he said, and the sentence opened out into smaller admissions. "I thought I could manage everything." "You managed the wrong thing," Chloe replied. "You managed your image. You didn't manage your heart." He felt embarrassed in the way a child might in front of a parent, suddenly exposed to a truth he had been arranging papers around. The hospital stay was a liminal thing. He had been forced into physical stillness, and with it the mental work that stillness demanded. He attended, begrudgingly at first, and then with a deeper commitment, to counseling sessions that his sister insisted on. He sat with a therapist who did not provide clever press-friendly phrases, but asked questions about the kind of man he wanted to be. "Who would you be if you had to lose all the trappings?" she asked in one session, and the question lodged like a splinter. In the weeks that followed, Quentin's timeline began to rearrange itself. He stopped scheduling everything into neat, purchasable solutions and took smaller, slower steps. It started with humility, a short public statement in which he refused to shape the narrative and instead validated Sally's autonomy. It was not a demand for forgiveness. It was an admission of error that was, in its modesty, radical. He had PR people who winced. He had colleagues who worried aloud. But he stood by it. He apologized, without theatricality, for asking someone to live in the shadows for his comfort. The second thing he did, less public, more consequential, was to reach out quietly to the people who mattered to Sally. He wrote a letter to her parents, not an argument, but a straightforward condolence for the trouble she had endured. He met her mother at a suburban cafe and listened as she spoke of the practical difficulties the scandal had caused. A parent who withdrew a child from the studio, a donation that never materialized, a job interview that had been awkward because someone asked pointed questions. He offered, without the pressure of publicity, financial support for a community program that would give scholarships to kids who otherwise could not afford dance classes. He did not present the offer as a bargaining chip. He presented it as reparation. Sally did not answer his first few messages. She had shut the door not to punish him, but to protect herself. She had felt what it was to be treated like an expendable privilege, and she guarded her life accordingly. When she did finally respond, the message was a single line and very careful. "Thank you for supporting programs. I asked for space." He respected that space. Respect felt new because it required restraint. For a man raised to think of movement as power, the ability to stay quiet was a kind of discipline. He used his absence to learn how to show up in ways that were helpful and not possessive. Meanwhile, the city and its appetite for spectacle moved through its cycles. Bianca's momentum faltered as industry insiders began to see her manipulation of moments as a brand risk. A leaked memo showed something unsavory in her PR strategy. She lost a key sponsorship. The public's hunger for fresh targets found other prey. None of this erased the damage done to Sally, but it relieved the pressure into which she had been cast. People moved on because that is what the medium they lived in does. Gossip is a fire that consumes a stack of brush and then looks for the next fuel. Sally's life with Sam deepened in a quieter register. They spent weekends in which nothing particularly dramatic happened. Grocery lists, a neighbor's barbecue, Sam reading at the kitchen table while Sally sewed a patch on Zoe's coat. He proposed, one evening on the back stoop beneath a single string of warm light, in a way that differed from anything Quentin had ever done. There were no flashbulbs. There was a plain tin ring that had belonged to his grandmother, simple and imperfect, like the promise it represented. Sam's proposal was not dramatic because it didn't need to be. It was an offer of partnership, asking if she would step forward into a stable shared life that acknowledged the messy parts of both of them. Sally said she needed time. She had learned during the months since leaving Quentin that decisions about love could not be rushed, particularly when they sat against the sediment of betrayal. She loved Sam's steadiness. It was like a rhythm that had a clear pattern and a dependable beat. But part of her also felt the old pull toward closure, the human need to know whether Quentin had truly altered his coordinates or whether his gestures were a strategy to recover what he had lost. Quentin, for his part, did not seek theatrical gestures to prove his transformation. He organized a small, sustained string of actions. He attended community board meetings about arts funding and sat through the debates he might once have outsourced. He met with the dance studio's manager and asked about needs rather than issuing orders. He volunteered his time, in small increments, to reconfigure a studio's program for after-school care that would allow parents with multiple jobs to enroll their children. He also engaged in a kind of public humility, At a panel about corporate responsibility, he spoke up about visibility and privilege, about how secrecy in relationships was not an act of protection when it silenced another person's public life. His words were not perfect. They were raw and sometimes late, but they were backed by the work he was doing. That was what made the difference, the marriage of words to consistent acts. There were nights when he still found himself walking past the dance studio without entering. A habit of wanting to fix everything by his presence lingered. At first he tolerated that impulse and then learned to let it pass. He visited only when invited. Sometimes he left donations anonymously because he did not wish to induce discomfort. But sometimes, almost by accident, he attended a recital where he took a seat in the back, not to claim a corner of someone's life, but to witness the thing that had always been precious to him without trying to own it. He watched Sally move across the stage with the kind of authority he would have once considered incidental. In the small, luminous way of watching someone do what they are meant to do, he felt a fullness that was not about him. Chloe watched him change with a wary relief. "You are doing the work," she told him quietly one evening after he had spent 3 hours cleaning up the studio's storage room with the volunteers. "But don't think work absolves contempt. Keep being humble. Keep listening. Don't make this another transaction." "That's the hardest part," he admitted. "Listening without trying to fix everything." "Then do the hardest part," she said. "Let yourself be made by what you didn't own." Those months were not linear progressions but small slants. Quentin made mistakes, one misworded public statement, a well-intentioned gift that came off as intrusive, and each error required another course correction. He was learning that good faith is not an event, it's a trajectory. People around him began to notice, and sometimes they said so. His employees reported less of his previous impatience and more willingness to hear dissent. Investors grumbled about his time spent on community programs, but the company survived. The change cost him things he had not expected: time, vanity, and bought him others. A new sense of the scope of his commitments and a quieter, steadier presence in rooms that once revolved around him. Sally watched with a guarded curiosity. She tracked his acts, the way one checks the weather more than the clock. She observed that he had stopped posting private pictures of the two of them on social accounts, that he had publicly supported the studio's scholarship program, that he had, on a number of occasions, arranged for maintenance funds so that the old floor could be replaced. It unsettled her to see him do things without demanding attribution. She felt, whenever she could, a curious, complicated warmth. Memory has a power that doesn't always respect reason. But she also felt wary. People can change for reasons that serve their own ends, and she had been around people who promised everything and did not mean it. Sam, who loved Sally not because she was a prize, but because she was a person, watched Quentin's efforts with both gratitude for what they did for Sally and suspicion for what motives might remain. One afternoon, over tea, he asked Sally quietly what she wanted, not from Quentin but from her life. "I want honesty," she said, stirring sugar into her cup. "I want to be someone who is seen without having to be secret. If Quentin changes, I will listen. But I will not let myself be the settlement of a man's conscience. I'm not here to fix someone's reputation." Sam reached out and squeezed her hand. "And if you never want him again?" "Then I will know that I did the right thing," she replied. "I will be where I belong, where my work is respected, and my niece can run in the yard without anyone whispering." Time kept its steady hand. The community programs flourished. Children who once could not afford lessons found themselves turning in neat little shoes and attending classes that taught them discipline and the capacity for joy. Zoe grew into a confident child who needed less protection than she once had, and Sally watched that growth with something like pride. The rupture between the three principal persons, Sally, Quentin, Sam, began to rearrange into a different architecture. Quentin continued to do the work without expectation. Sam continued to be patient and intentional. Sally continued to keep her agency at the center. It was a fragile constellation, balanced on mutual respect and careful daily choices. Then came the night when everything that had been slow and careful demanded a decision. The studio hosted its annual recital, a pageant of small triumphs. A 7-year-old finally balancing on a point for a single second, a teenager speaking into a microphone about how dancing had kept them out of trouble, Sally calling the names of her students as if each one were a kind of victory. The auditorium hummed. Parents sobbed quietly. The air smelled of rosin and perfume, a scent that had, in Quentin's mind, always been associated with a life he had once held close. Quentin sat in the back row, not because he wished to be in sight, but because he wanted to unobtrusively witness the whole thing. He had not contacted Sally beforehand. He had paid to secure a seat months ago through a mutual volunteer he had befriended. He thought he would be able to remain anonymous. When people asked about him afterward, he simply said he had come to watch. Watching felt finally like a devotional practice rather than an attempt at ownership. Sally danced at the center of one of the final numbers. Light pooled at her feet. She moved as if the music had been written for her lungs and not for the city. There was a particular quiet in her face that had not always been there. The serenity of someone who has decided not to let other people's stories define her. When the curtain fell, the applause washed across the room like water, and she felt it gather around her like a small shore. After the show, the lobby filled with bouquets and parents and the bright chatter of adrenaline. Sam stood near her, his expression a mix of triumph and tenderness. He had been supportive in ways that were reliable and small, sewing on costume pieces, holding a child's hand through stage fright, bringing soup when rehearsals ran late. He leaned in close now and kissed the top of Sally's head in the way of someone offering home. Quentin watched, and the sight was both painful and pure. He had imagined getting down on a knee and asking for a chance to write everything. He had imagined statements and apologies and public demonstrations. But the sight of Sally surrounded by ordinary care, children's sticky hands, a tired parent's grin, Sam steady at her side, resolved something in him. He could not demand the thing he wanted. The only way forward was through consent she might freely give. He left the lobby without announcing himself. Walking into the rainy night outside, he felt the city's old wet cold, but there was also a different sensation, a readiness to accept the cost of his prior choices. He had learned in the months since the hospital that some things cannot be reclaimed. What he could do now was to live with the consequences of what he had done and the humility of what he had learned. Weeks later, he arranged to speak with Sally in a public place she frequented, the cafe by the rehearsal hall where the barista kept her order ready and where students sometimes sat practicing choreography on tablets. He would have preferred to speak to her privately, but understood the need to avoid pressure. He sat at a table and waited, and when she arrived, she was composed, carrying the dignity of someone who had been honed, not dimmed, by struggle. "Sally," he said, standing up as she approached. He had the word, and then steadied himself. "Thank you for meeting me." She sat, folding her hands with the habitual economy of a teacher who had learned to manage both applause and critique. "You don't owe performances," she said. "I know," he replied. "I owe accountability." He placed a small envelope on the table between them. It contained a letter, not a plea, not a manifesto, outlining the practical steps he had taken and would continue to take, details of the scholarship fund in Zoe's name, the commitments he had made to the studio's maintenance, and records of his counseling, and the steps he'd taken to ensure he would not repeat the harm. He did not demand forgiveness. He did not ask for a response. He wanted simply to be transparent. Sally read the letter with steady eyes. When she looked up, there was something in the way she held herself that let him know whether the work had registered. "You've been doing things," she said. "I see it." "That's all I could do," he said. "I thought I could speak my way back. I was wrong, so I tried to build a new ledger, one that doesn't rely on a single public gesture. Actions speak louder than notes in an envelope," she said. "I will say this. What you did for the studio was real, and it helped kids I love. That matters." "Can I ask something?" he pressed quieter. "Not a demand. If you ever considered—" He stopped. The grammar of his question required care, and he had misused it many times before. "You're asking if I might come back?" she finished for him. He nodded. Shame and want braided into the gesture. She looked at him for a long moment. "I will not go back to secrecy." Her voice was firm. "If there is anything between us, it must be visible to the people who matter to me. It must be an arrangement where I am seen and safe. It must be—" She searched for the plainest word. "Honest." "That is fair," he said. "I understand. I will not ask for anything less. And if you say no, I will accept that and continue to do what I've promised." She folded the letter, placed it back into the envelope, and then did something that had nothing to do with rescue or rancor. She offered him a piece of information he had not expected. "Sam proposed," she said simply. He felt a physical sting, not of jealousy, but of recognition that life, absent of him, was still a life worth wanting. He had to let the image stand without trying to pound it back into another shape. He offered a small smile and meant it. "Then he must be a very good man," he said. "He is," she answered. "He is honest, and he does the work of proving it every day. I owe him the same patience you asked of me, time to be sure." "Then I can only wish you both happiness," Quentin said. The words were the only ones fit for the moment, a wish unadorned and sincere. "If you ever want anything from me, aid, logistical help, an apology in front of people, I will provide it. I don't expect more." They stood, and for a beat the room seemed to catch its breath. In the rain outside, the city washed itself, indifferent and necessary. Sally walked away with the letter in her palm. Quentin watched the small, sure arc of her back and felt gratitude for the chance to witness what he had once neglected. Months later, he attended an intimate gathering at the studio, not as a man seeking absolution, but as a guest who had been invited because his actions had made space for children to dance. He watched as Sally cut a ribbon for a newly refurbished rehearsal room. Her face carried the kind of plain joy that is rooted in labor and fidelity. Sam stood nearby, steady and present, and when Sally glanced in Quentin's direction, there was a recognition and a quiet nod. No fireworks, no melodrama. Just a town that keeps living. Quentin left the event with a different kind of fullness, one that had nothing to do with returning possessions and everything to do with the work of sustaining them. He had not regained what he had lost. Instead, he had been given something harder. The knowledge of how to be a better person because of what he'd learned. There is an odd grace in that kind of education. It cost him his illusions, and it rewarded him with the capacity to see. The months continued to go by, and the ledger filled with modest but meaningful entries. Quentin maintained the scholarship and grew used to showing up for things he would not have once considered necessary, like reading lines at a fundraiser where actors performed poems to raise funds for arts education. He spoke without making himself the main point. The habit of being a spectator and not a proprietor became less onerous and more right. He continued in therapy, and he began to do volunteer work teaching young men about accountability and consent, leaning into the painful lessons he himself had once ignored. Sally accepted Sam's marriage proposal in due course, choosing stability and respect. Their wedding was a modest celebration held in a park where the community studio had once rented a rehearsal room. Quentin attended as a guest, not a groom, and he was not asked to speak. When Sally and Sam pledged their vows, Quentin felt a strange, unmixed joy. He had loved Sally, and love is not always possessive. He had come to see his attachment in a new light. Loving someone can mean wanting them to be well, even if their joy is not tethered to your own redemption. After the ceremony, in a quiet corner away from cameras and congratulatory hands, Sally found Quentin and offered him a small, sincere smile. "Thank you for what you did for the kids," she said. "You deserve to be seen," he replied. "And you deserve to learn how to see," she said, and the exchange was neither victory nor defeat. It was a mutual acknowledgement of the human work done. Chloe watched the pair with a cool eye. She had insisted on her brother's accountability, and she had gotten it, not because she wanted to punish him, but because she had seen how costly avoidance could be. She let herself feel satisfaction, not as a vindictive thing, but as a witness to a brother who had finally stopped believing his image could replace his moral choices. Bianca faded out of the story with the natural cooling of a scandal that had been built on brittle material. She lost a few partnerships and had to recalibrate her career without the same easy self-projection. It was not a poetic justice scene so much as the realistic consequence of choices that used others as props. She moved on, as people do. The moral of it was not designed, only observed. Spectacle begets consequences susceptible to the tides of reputation. Years later, an observer might glance at the stories of the three principal people and misread them as a simple arc of loss and redemption. But life held more complexity. Quentin had not become a saint. He still made mistakes and learned from them slowly. Sally had not found a perfect man. She found a partner who shared her values and the patience she needed after having been hurt. Sam did not have a story of grand conquest. He had the quiet life of steady commitment that had once seemed ordinary, and therefore, in its ordinariness, luminous. There were small memorials to what had been, an orchid pendant in a jewelry box in Sally's drawer, kept not as a token of ownership but as a reminder of a shape that had once mattered. Sometimes it would catch the light when she opened the drawer, and she would smile at a memory that was not sharp with pain but gentle with a lesson. The city continued to hum. Children pirouetted and tripped and got up again. Parents applauded. The dance studio held more recitals. Quentin sometimes watched from the back and felt gratitude that he could do so without trying to claim the stage. On a rainy afternoon, years after the first note had been left in his jacket, Quentin found himself walking through the same streets. He paused in front of a shop window and saw the reflection of a man who had been retooled by loss and by sustained work. He put his hand to the place behind his ear and felt nothing but a faint memory of an inked crescent. No possessive claim, only a contour of a past self. The rain had long ago stopped being an absolution. It was an element of reality, useful for washing streets and for reminding you that no one weather lasts forever. He had refused to marry her. She had walked away. Only then had he realized her worth. The realization had not returned what he'd once held. It had, instead, taught him what to do with a life that could be given and not owned. In the end, that was a lesson that made better people of the ones willing to do the slow labor of change. If this story moved you, share it with someone who would appreciate a quiet human reckoning, and tell us in the comments, when would you have left, and what would it take for someone to earn you back?